A crash in the frozen expanse. The wind howled like a wild beast across the frozen wasteland. Ethan, a human pilot, staggered through the knee-deep snow, his breath fogging the icy air. His ship lay in ruins behind him, a smoldering wreck that had barely shielded him from the planet's brutal crash landing. Now the bitter cold was his enemy, clawing at him with icy fingers and draining the life from his body with each passing second. He squinted into the storm, hoping to see some sign of shelter. The planet, an uncharted frozen world, was desolate. No trees, no animals, only endless white dunes stretching to the horizon. His boots crunched against the ice with every step, and he clutched his survival pack close, the faint warmth of the emergency blanket doing little to shield him from the biting cold. "Come on, Ethan," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling. "You can't give up now. Just a little further." His resolve was fading when a dark silhouette appeared in the distance. At first, it seemed like a mirage, a cruel trick of his frost-numbed mind. But as he stumbled closer, the shape solidified. A small structure, half buried in the snow. Relief surged through him, giving him the strength to break into a staggering run. The shelter was crude, built from reinforced metal panels and ancient-looking stone. A faint light flickered inside, visible through a frosted window. Ethan hesitated at the door, his instincts screaming caution. But the freezing air left him no choice. He pushed the door open, stepping inside and slamming it shut behind him. The interior was dimly lit and surprisingly warm. A single heat generator hummed in the corner, its glow casting long shadows across the room. Weapons lined the walls, blades, spears, and guns, all alien in design. Sitting near the heat source was a tall, muscular alien woman with skin the color of twilight and piercing silver eyes. She rose to her feet the moment he entered, her movements fluid and predatory. "Who are you, human?" she demanded, her voice sharp and commanding. Her hand went to the hilt of a curved blade at her waist. Ethan raised his hands in surrender, his teeth chattering too hard to speak. She studied him for a moment, her gaze narrowing, before gesturing to the heat generator. "Sit," she ordered. "Warm yourself, but don't think I trust you." Too cold to argue, Ethan obeyed. He dropped to his knees near the heat source, letting the warmth seep into his frozen body. Slowly, his shivering subsided, and he managed to speak. "My ship crashed," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know anyone lived here." The woman snorted. "No one does. This place is exile. I am Katheri, outcast of the Zale tribe. And you, human, have trespassed into my domain." Ethan swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to. I just needed shelter. Please, I'll leave as soon as the storm passes." Katheri tilted her head, her silver eyes gleaming with suspicion. "You won't survive out there. The cold will freeze you within minutes. You're weak." Ethan bristled at her words but held his tongue. He knew she was right. She crossed her arms, studying him as if deciding his fate. Finally, she spoke. "This storm will last the night. There's only one heat source in this shelter, and it's barely enough for one. If you wish to live, you'll follow my command." Her tone left no room for negotiation, and Ethan frowned. What command? Her gaze didn't waver. "Share my bed, human, or face the cold." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan felt his face flush, not from the heat but from the implications. "I what?" Katheri rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed by his reaction. "Do not misunderstand me, human. This is survival, not some romantic proposition. The bed is heated, and body warmth will keep us both alive. Refuse, and I'll leave you to the cold. The choice is yours." Ethan stared at her, weighing his options. She was intimidating, no doubt about it, but the cold outside was merciless. If he refused, he'd die. Reluctantly, he nodded. "Fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." Katheri smirked, a flicker of amusement crossing her sharp features. "Good. Then we'll see if you humans are as fragile as you seem." As Ethan settled into the small cot beside her, the warmth of the heated surface was a stark contrast to the icy death awaiting outside, but his mind raced with questions. Who was this Catheri? Why was she exiled? And most importantly, could he trust her? The storm howled louder outside, but inside the shelter, the tension was just as fierce. Uneasy companions. Ethan woke to the low hum of the heat generator and the sharp clang of metal. He blinked, momentarily disoriented, until he remembered where he was. The small, dimly lit shelter, the biting cold outside, and the alien warrior Catheri. He turned his head and saw her near the wall of weapons, sharpening a blade that gleamed faintly in the flickering light. Her posture was relaxed but purposeful, every movement precise. She hadn't noticed he was awake, or if she had, she didn't care. "Did you sleep well, human?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Ethan hesitated, caught off guard. "As well as I could, considering the circumstances." Catheri chuckled softly, a sound that was both amused and dismissive. "You're lucky you didn't freeze to death. Humans are so fragile. A single night outside, and you'd be nothing but an ice sculpture." Ethan sat up, pulling the emergency blanket tighter around himself. "Thanks for the reminder. You Zale must be built differently." Her sharpening paused for a moment, and she glanced at him. "We are warriors, bred for survival. Weakness is not tolerated among my kind." Ethan studied her, noting the faint scars that crisscrossed her arms and the way she held the blade with practiced ease. She looked every bit the soldier she claimed to be, but there was something else, an undercurrent of pain in her voice when she mentioned her people. "You said you were exiled," he ventured cautiously. "Why?" Catheri's gaze hardened, and she resumed sharpening the blade. "That's not your concern, human. I'm just trying to understand," Ethan said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "We're stuck here together. Knowing each other might help." She laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Trust me, human. Understanding won't help you. It might even get you killed." Ethan decided to drop the subject, sensing he'd pushed too far. Instead, he turned his attention to the shelter. It was Spartan, with little more than the cot, the heat generator, and the arsenal of weapons. The walls were reinforced, suggesting it was built to withstand more than just the weather. "What is this place?" he asked. "A hunting outpost," Catheri replied without looking up. "Abandoned years ago. I claimed it when I had nowhere else to go." "Hunting what?" She smiled, and it wasn't comforting. "Things that make your frost wolves look like harmless pups." Ethan felt a chill, and it wasn't from the cold. He remembered the strange howls he'd heard during the night and the faint claw marks on the shelter's outer walls. "And those things, they come here often." Catheri stood and sheathed her blade with a practiced motion. "Often enough, but they're not the biggest threat." "What is?" Ethan asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Catheri's expression darkened, and for the first time, she looked genuinely uneasy. "The cold makes creatures desperate, but the real danger is the ones who are hunting me." Ethan frowned. "Who's hunting you?" She leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "My clan, or what's left of them. I broke their rules, and now they want me dead." Ethan's heart sank. "So they could come here." Catheri nodded. "They've been tracking me for weeks. If they find me, they won't leave witnesses." The weight of her words settled over Ethan like a heavy blanket. He was already fighting to survive the harsh conditions, and now he had to worry about alien assassins. He wanted to blame her for dragging him into this, but deep down, he knew he didn't have a choice. If she hadn't let him into the shelter, he'd be dead by now. "What did you do to make them so angry?" he asked. Her silver eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, he thought she might not answer. But then she said, "I refused to follow their path. I rejected a bond with a warlord, defied the rules, and abandoned the bloodline they value above all else. To them, I'm a traitor." Ethan swallowed hard. Sounds like you're braver than they are. Katheri blinked, clearly not expecting his response. Or stupider, she said after a pause. Bravery doesn't mean much when you're dead. Before Ethan could reply, a sudden noise outside the shelter made them both freeze. It was faint but distinct, the crunch of footsteps on snow. Katheri moved instantly, grabbing a weapon from the wall and signaling for Ethan to stay quiet. The tension in the room was suffocating as the footsteps grew louder. Katheri crouched by the door, her body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. Ethan stayed back, clutching a small metal rod he'd found near the cot. He knew it wouldn't be much help, but it was better than nothing. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. A shadow passed across the frosted window, and Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, it wasn't friendly. Katheri gestured for Ethan to move to the corner, away from the door. He obeyed, his pulse racing. She held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. The door burst open, and chaos erupted. The frost wolves' attack. The night was deathly silent, save for the faint hum of the heat generator. Ethan was restless, lying awake on the cot, staring at the dimly lit ceiling. His mind replayed Katheri's words from earlier. She was being hunted by her own people, exiled for breaking their laws. It was a grim tale, but it didn't explain everything. There were gaps in her story, parts she clearly wasn't willing to share. A sudden low growl broke the silence, sending a shiver down Ethan's spine. He froze, straining to listen. The growl came again, deeper this time, followed by the sound of something heavy scraping against the shelter's exterior. He sat up, heart pounding. "Katheri," he whispered. Katheri, who had been sitting near the door sharpening a spear, was already on her feet. Her silver eyes narrowed as she glanced toward the source of the noise. Without a word, she grabbed a blaster from the wall and motioned for Ethan to stay put. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Trouble," she replied tersely. "Stay quiet." The growling grew louder, joined by more guttural sounds. Ethan's stomach sank as he realized there wasn't just one creature outside. There were several. The scraping turned into clawing, and the metal walls of the shelter groaned under the pressure. Katheri peered through the frosted window, her jaw tightening. "Frost wolves," she muttered. "They've caught our scent." Ethan's blood ran cold. He'd seen the damage these creatures could do. His ship had been shredded by their razor-sharp claws before he'd even had a chance to defend himself. "Can they get in?" "They'll try," Katheri said grimly. "This shelter is strong, but it's old. If they find a weak spot, we're done." As if on cue, a loud thud echoed through the shelter as one of the wolves slammed its massive body against the door. Ethan scrambled to his feet, looking around for anything he could use as a weapon. He found a jagged metal rod near the heat generator and gripped it tightly, though it felt woefully inadequate. "Do you even know how to fight?" Katheri asked, her tone skeptical as she saw him fumbling with the rod. "Not like this," Ethan admitted, his voice shaking. "But I'll do what I can." Katheri snorted, a flicker of amusement breaking through her grim demeanor. "Stay out of my way, and maybe you'll survive." Another loud crash rattled the walls, and Ethan flinched. He could see the outlines of the wolves now, their massive bodies circling the shelter. Their glowing eyes pierced the darkness, and their jagged teeth gleamed as they snapped at the edges of the structure. Katheri didn't waste time. She opened a small panel on the wall, revealing a control console. "If they breach the walls, the heat generator will attract them. We can't let them get inside." "What do we do?" Ethan asked, panic creeping into his voice. Katheri glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "We fight." Before Ethan could protest, the door buckled under the weight of a massive frost wolf. Katheri moved like lightning, raising her blaster and firing a precise shot. The wolf yelped as the energy bolt struck its shoulder, but it didn't back down. Instead, it clawed at the door with renewed fury, its packmates joining the assault. Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline. He couldn't just stand there. Gripping the metal rod, he positioned himself near the heat generator, ready to defend it if the wolves got inside. Catheri fought with a ferocity that took Ethan's breath away. She fired her blaster with deadly accuracy, each shot lighting up the room as it struck its target. When the blaster overheated, she didn't hesitate to switch to her spear, lunging at the wolves with swift, precise movements. Her agility was unmatched, and for a moment, Ethan wondered if she'd been holding back her true abilities earlier. But the wolves were relentless. One of them managed to rip a panel off the wall, creating a small breach. Icy wind rushed into the shelter, and Ethan could feel the temperature dropping rapidly. A wolf squeezed through the gap, its massive form looming over him. Ethan swung the metal rod with all his strength, hitting the wolf square on the nose. The creature snarled, shaking its head in pain, but it didn't retreat. It lunged at him, and he barely managed to dodge, falling to the ground as its claws raked the air where he'd been standing. "Ethan," Catheri shouted. She hurled a dagger with pinpoint accuracy, the blade sinking into the wolf's side. It collapsed with a pained howl, but more were already forcing their way through the breach. "We can't hold them off forever," Ethan yelled, his voice cracking. Catheri gritted her teeth, her spear sweeping in wide arcs as she fought to keep the wolves at bay. "We don't have to, just long enough for this." She slammed her fist against the console, activating the sequence. A low hum filled the shelter, followed by a sudden burst of light. The wolves recoiled, yelping in confusion as the light grew brighter. "What did you do?" Ethan asked, shielding his eyes. "Set the perimeter defense to overload," Catheri said, her voice trained. "It'll drive them back, but it'll drain the power." Ethan's stomach sank. The heat generator. Without power, they'd have no way to stay warm. "Are you crazy? We'll freeze." "Better than being eaten," Catheri snapped. "Now hold them off." The light reached its peak, and the wolves howled in pain before retreating into the darkness. Catheri slammed the door shut, securing the breach as best she could. The shelter fell silent once more, save for their labored breathing. Ethan collapsed against the wall, his body trembling from the adrenaline and the cold seeping in. That was insane. Catheri leaned against her spear, her expression grim. "You're alive, aren't you?" "For now," Ethan muttered, shivering. "But what happens when the power runs out?" Catheri didn't answer. She didn't need to. The frost wolves might have been driven off, but the true battle for survival was just beginning. The true danger revealed. The storm outside raged on, the howling wind battering the reinforced walls of the shelter. The faint glow of the heat generator had dimmed after Catheri overloaded the perimeter defenses to drive off the frost wolves. The air inside was growing colder, and the silence between the two survivors was as heavy as the frost-laden atmosphere outside. Ethan sat slumped against the wall, his breaths visible in the chill. His hands trembled as he held the jagged metal rod, more out of lingering fear than the cold. Catheri was at the console, her sharp features illuminated by the faint flicker of its struggling power. She had said little since the attack, her focus entirely on the damaged systems. "How bad is it?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Catheri didn't look up. "Bad. The generator's power is nearly depleted, and the defenses won't hold if the wolves return." Ethan swallowed hard. "Can't we repair it? Recharge it somehow?" Her silver eyes flicked to him briefly, her expression unreadable. "Not with what we have here. This shelter was never meant for long-term survival." Ethan's frustration bubbled over. "So what's the plan? Sit here and freeze to death. Hope those wolves don't come back." Catheri stood abruptly, her towering presence both commanding and unnerving. "The plan," she said, her voice sharp, "is to keep moving. There's another outpost 2 days from here. It has better defenses and supplies." 2 days, Ethan echoed, his voice rising. "In this storm, without power, that's suicide." Katheri leaned closer, her tone icy. Staying here is suicide. Out there, at least we have a chance. Ethan opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. She was right. As much as he hated to admit it, sitting here and waiting for death wasn't an option. Still, the idea of trekking through the frozen wilderness with someone he barely trusted filled him with dread. As he mulled over their grim prospects, Katheri began gathering supplies. She moved with purpose, strapping weapons to her belt and securing her survival pack. Ethan watched her, his mind racing with questions he hadn't dared to ask before. "Why are you doing this?" he finally said. "Why not leave me here and save yourself?" Katheri paused, her back to him. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then she turned, her gaze colder than the storm outside. "Because I owed you." Ethan blinked, confused. "Owe me? For what?" Her jaw tightened. "For fighting beside me against the wolves. Most humans would have cowered in the corner and let me handle it. You didn't. That means something." Ethan was taken aback. He hadn't thought of his actions as brave, just desperate. But her words carried weight, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something in her expression that wasn't disdain. Respect, maybe. "Besides," she added, her tone softening slightly, "if I left you here, I'd have to carry the guilt, and I have enough of that already." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Ethan couldn't ignore the opportunity to press further. "What kind of guilt?" Katheri's eyes narrowed, and she turned away. "That's none of your concern." Ethan pushed himself to his feet, the cold making his movements stiff. "It is my concern if we're going to survive together. I need to know what I'm dealing with." She hesitated, her hands clenching into fists. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and filled with bitterness. "I told you before, I defied my clan. But it wasn't just about refusing to marry some warlord. It was about breaking the cycle of violence they worship." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Katheri's gaze seemed to pierce through him. "The Zale value strength above all else. They train from birth to be warriors, to conquer, to dominate. I was no different. I was raised to fight, to kill, to take what I wanted without question." She paced the room, her movements restless. "But I saw the cost of it. The lives destroyed, the families torn apart. My clan's pride blinded them to the damage they caused. So I refused to be a part of it. I walked away." Ethan was silent, letting her words sink in. He could hear the pain beneath her defiance, the weight of a decision that had cost her everything. "They called me a traitor," she continued. "Said I was weak. They sent hunters after me to cleanse the stain from their honor. And now, they won't stop until I'm dead." Ethan's stomach churned. "And I'm caught in the middle of this." Katheri stopped pacing and faced him, her expression hard. "Yes, but if you want to survive, you'll stop thinking of yourself as a victim. Out here, we're all prey." Her words stung, but Ethan knew she was right. He couldn't afford to wallow in fear. Not if they were going to make it out alive. "What's at this other outpost?" he asked, changing the subject. "Supplies, weapons, maybe even a way off this planet," Katheri said. "But it won't be easy to get there. The storm is only half the danger." Ethan frowned. "And the other half?" Katheri's lips curled into a grim smile. "The hunters. If they find us before we reach the outpost, we won't live to see another sunrise." The gravity of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Their journey was going to be a fight for survival, against the elements, the predators, and the unseen forces chasing them. But as daunting as it all seemed, Ethan felt a spark of determination. He wasn't ready to die. Not yet. And if Katheri could face her demons, maybe he could find the strength to face his own. "All right," he said, gripping the metal rod tighter. "Let's do this." Katheri nodded, a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Good. Then get ready, human. The storm waits for no one." With that, they prepared to step into the frozen wilds, their fates intertwined by necessity and the unrelenting force of survival. Escape into the frozen wilds. The shelter door groaned against the icy wind as Catheri shoved it open. A blast of frigid air hit Ethan like a physical blow, cutting through the layers of clothing he'd hastily thrown on. He tightened his grip on the makeshift walking stick Catheri had fashioned for him from a broken spear shaft. It was crude but sturdy, and he suspected he'd need it more for survival than for walking. "Stay close to me," Catheri said, her voice barely audible over the storm's roar. She stood tall and unyielding against the wind, her silhouette sharp and imposing in the dim light of the snow-covered wasteland. Her silver eyes scanned the horizon, searching for threats. Ethan nodded, pulling his scarf tighter around his face. "How far is this outpost again?" 2 days, Catheri replied, her tone flat. "If we're lucky." "And if we're not?" Ethan asked, regretting the question as soon as it left his mouth. Catheri's gaze flicked toward him, her expression hard. "Then you'll learn why the Zale don't fear the cold as much as what hunts in it." Ethan swallowed hard, deciding it was better not to press further. He adjusted the straps on his survival pack and fell in step behind her. The storm was relentless, the snow thick and blinding. Each step felt like a battle, the icy ground threatening to steal his balance at every turn. Hours passed in a monotonous blur of cold and exhaustion. Ethan's muscles burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Catheri, on the other hand, moved with an efficiency that made him feel woefully inadequate. She seemed unaffected by the biting wind, her every step purposeful. "How do you do it?" Ethan asked, his voice muffled by his scarf. Catheri didn't stop or look back. "Do what?" "Keep going like this," Ethan said. "You don't even look tired." "I've had practice," she said simply. "The cold is a weapon. If you fear it, it will defeat you. If you endure it, you can wield it." Ethan frowned. "That's oddly poetic for someone who called me fragile." Catheri smirked, the faintest hint of amusement breaking through her stoic demeanor. "Even fragile things can survive if they're clever enough." Their exchange was cut short by a sound that made Ethan's blood run colder than the storm ever could. A low, guttural growl, barely audible over the wind. He froze, his grip tightening on his walking stick. Catheri stopped as well, her posture shifting instantly into a defensive stance. Her hand went to the hilt of her blade, her sharp gaze scanning the swirling snow. "Frost wolves," she muttered. Ethan's stomach twisted. "How many?" Catheri tilted her head, listening intently. "At least 3. Maybe more." Panic surged through Ethan. "Can we outrun them?" Catheri's expression was grim. "No, they're faster in this terrain. Our best chance is to stand our ground." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Stand our ground. Against those things. "Unless you have a better idea," she snapped, drawing her blade. The weapon gleamed faintly in the dim light, its edges etched with alien symbols. She handed him a smaller knife from her belt. "Use this. Aim for the eyes or the throat." Ethan hesitated, staring at the blade in his trembling hands. "I've never fought anything like this before." Catheri's gaze softened, if only slightly. "Then stay behind me and watch. Learn quickly, or die." The growls grew louder, closer, until 3 massive forms emerged from the storm. The frost wolves were even more terrifying up close, their thick, spiked fur coated with ice, and their glowing blue eyes fixed on their prey. Their snarls revealed rows of razor-sharp teeth, and their breath came out in clouds of steam. Catheri moved first, her blade flashing as she lunged at the lead wolf. The creature dodged, but she anticipated the move, twisting mid-strike to slash at its flank. Her movements were precise and fluid, like a dancer performing a deadly routine. The second wolf circled toward Ethan, its eyes locking onto him with predatory intent. He stumbled back, his heart racing, but Catheri's earlier words echoed in his mind. Aim for the eyes or the throat. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Ethan raised the knife as the wolf pounced. Time seemed to slow as the creature leaped through the air, its jaws snapping. He sidestepped at the last moment, swinging the blade in a desperate arc. The knife sliced across the wolf's face, and it howled in pain, skidding to the ground. Ethan barely had time to process what had happened before the third wolf charged at him. This time, he wasn't fast enough. The creature knocked him to the ground, its massive weight pinning him. He struggled, the wolf's icy breath hot against his face. Just as it lunged for his throat, Catheri's blade came down, piercing its neck in a spray of blood. "Get up," she barked, yanking him to his feet. The remaining wolves hesitated, their glowing eyes darting between Catheri and their fallen packmate. She raised her blade, her stance defiant. "Go on, then," she growled. "Try your luck." The wolves snarled but eventually retreated into the storm, their howls fading into the distance. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. That was insane. Catheri wiped her blade clean on the snow and sheathed it. "You're alive, aren't you?" "Barely," Ethan muttered, staring at the blood-stained knife in his hand. Catheri extended a hand, pulling him to his feet. "Good. Then you'll be stronger next time." Ethan wanted to argue, to tell her how close he'd come to dying, but he knew it wouldn't matter. She was right. Out here, survival meant adapting. Fast. As they resumed their trek through the frozen wilds, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The frost wolves were dangerous, but the true predators, the ones hunting Catheri, were still out there. And if they found the pair before they reached the outpost, there would be no second chances. A sacrifice for survival. The storm had eased by morning, but the icy wasteland remained treacherous. Ethan's legs ached with every step, his breath coming out in visible puffs. Despite the exhaustion, he pressed on, driven by Catheri's relentless pace and the knowledge that stopping wasn't an option. The frost wolves might have retreated, but the memory of their glowing eyes haunted him. Catheri walked ahead, her figure a shadow against the endless white. She moved with a sense of purpose, her silver eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. The alien warrior had said little since the attack, her focus entirely on navigating the perilous terrain. "Are we getting close?" Ethan finally asked, his voice hoarse from the cold and fatigue. Catheri stopped and glanced back at him. "Closer than we were. The outpost is near a ravine. We should see it by nightfall." Ethan nodded, though his heart sank at the thought of enduring several more hours in the freezing cold. His survival pack felt heavier with each step, and the icy wind seemed determined to sap every ounce of his strength. As they trudged forward, a distant hum reached Ethan's ears. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing moment. He stopped, frowning. "Do you hear that?" Catheri's head snapped up, her body tensing like a coiled spring. Her hand instinctively went to the hilt of her blade. "Hunters," she said, her voice low and sharp. Ethan's stomach turned. "Hunters? You mean?" "Zal trackers," she confirmed, cutting him off. "They found us." The hum grew into a roar as a sleek, dark ship emerged from the clouds, its silhouette cutting through the sky like a predator stalking its prey. The ship circled above them, its engines rumbling ominously. "They'll land soon," Catheri said, her expression grim. "We need to move." "Move where?" Ethan asked, panic creeping into his voice. "We're in the middle of nowhere." Catheri pointed toward a jagged cluster of rocks in the distance. "There, we can use the terrain to our advantage." Ethan didn't argue. He followed her as she sprinted toward the rocks, his heart pounding. The ship's roar grew louder, and he risked a glance over his shoulder. The vessel was descending, its landing gear extending as it touched down on the frozen ground. Catheri reached the rocks first, ducking behind a large boulder and motioning for Ethan to do the same. He collapsed beside her, gasping for breath. "What now?" She didn't answer immediately, her focus on the ship. The vessel's hatch hissed open, and a group of Zal warriors emerged. They were clad in dark armor that shimmered faintly in the dim light, their movements precise and coordinated. Each carried a weapon, and their silver eyes gleamed with the same predatory intensity as Katheri's. "They'll split up to cover more ground," Katheri said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When they do, we strike." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "Strike? You mean fight them?" "Yes," she said, her tone leaving no room for debate. "They won't stop until they have me, or until I'm dead. And if they find you, they won't hesitate to kill you too." Ethan's mouth went dry. "Great. No pressure." Katheri's gaze softened slightly. "I won't let them harm you, human. But I can't do this alone." Her words steadied him, if only slightly. He nodded, gripping the knife she'd given him. "All right. What's the plan?" She outlined a strategy, her voice calm and steady despite the danger. They would use the rocks as cover, striking quickly and retreating before the hunters could regroup. It was a risky plan, but it was their best shot. The Zell warriors split into smaller groups, just as Katheri had predicted. She moved first, her blade flashing as she struck down the nearest hunter. Ethan followed her lead, using the element of surprise to his advantage. His attacks were clumsy compared to hers, but desperation made up for his lack of skill. The fight was brutal and chaotic. Katheri moved like a storm, her every strike precise and lethal. Ethan struggled to keep up, but he held his own, managing to wound one of the hunters before Katheri finished them off. But their luck didn't last. The remaining hunters regrouped, their tactics shifting as they cornered the pair against the rocks. Ethan's heart sank as he realized they were outnumbered and outmatched. Katheri glanced at him, her expression resolute. "There's only one way out of this." "What are you talking about?" Ethan asked, panic rising in his chest. She handed him a small device, a locator beacon. "Take this. It's linked to the outpost. Activate it when you get close, and it'll guide you the rest of the way." Ethan shook his head, his voice trembling. "No, I'm not leaving you here." "You have to," she said firmly. "If we both stay, we'll die. But if you make it to the outpost, you can call for help." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to refuse, but the determination in her eyes left no room for debate. She had already made up her mind. Before he could say anything, Katheri stepped forward, drawing the hunter's attention. "You want me," she shouted, her voice echoing across the frozen expanse. "Come and get me." The hunters charged, and Katheri met them head-on, her blade a blur of motion. Ethan hesitated for a moment, torn between staying and running. But he knew Katheri was right. If he stayed, her sacrifice would be in vain. Clutching the beacon, he turned and ran, the sounds of the battle fading behind him. Each step was a struggle, his heart heavy with guilt and fear. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Katheri's words echoed in his mind. Survive. Endure. Find a way. And so, he kept going, the beacon his only guide in the endless white. A new alliance. Ethan stumbled through the icy expanse, the locator beacon clutched tightly in his frozen fingers. Each step was agonizing, his muscles screaming in protest, but he pressed on. The faint hum of the beacon guided him, its steady pulse the only assurance that the outpost was close. Yet his mind wasn't on the journey. It was back with Katheri. The memory of her standing against the Zale hunters burned in his mind. Her defiance, her unwavering determination to buy him time, had left an impression he couldn't shake. He had wanted to stay, to fight alongside her, but she had made it clear her sacrifice was his chance to survive. "Don't let it be for nothing," Ethan muttered to himself, the words more for his own resolve than anyone else. The terrain began to change, the flat expanse giving way to jagged cliffs and narrow paths. The wind howled through the ravine ahead, but the beacon's pulse grew stronger, urging him forward. He squinted into the distance and saw it, a structure built into the rock, its metallic walls glinting faintly in the weak sunlight. "The outpost," he whispered, relief washing over him. But the sight brought little comfort. Catherie's absence was a heavy weight on his chest. He didn't know if she was alive, or if the hunters had overwhelmed her. The thought of her facing them alone made his stomach churn. Ethan reached the outpost's entrance, his hands trembling as he activated the door panel. It hissed open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The warmth hit him like a wave, and he nearly collapsed from the sudden change. He staggered inside, leaning against the wall as the door sealed shut behind him. The outpost was functional but sparse, just like Catherine had described. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with survival supplies and weapons. A central console blinked with status updates, and a small heat generator hummed in the corner. It was everything they needed to survive, but it felt hollow without her. Ethan activated the console, scanning the systems for any communication capabilities. To his relief, the outpost had a distress beacon. He quickly programmed it to send a signal to the nearest Zale frequencies, hoping it would reach someone who could help Catherine. "Come on," he muttered, his fingers fumbling over the controls. "Please work." The console beeped, confirming the signal had been sent. Ethan slumped into a nearby chair, exhaustion threatening to pull them under. But just as his eyes began to close, the console beeped again, a proximity alert. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat. He grabbed a weapon from the wall, his body tense as he waited for whatever had triggered the alarm. The seconds felt like hours, each one stretching endlessly. The door hissed open, and Ethan raised the weapon, his finger hovering over the trigger. But instead of a hunter, Catherine staggered inside, her armor dented and her body battered. She leaned heavily on her blade, blood staining the edges. "Catherine." Ethan dropped the weapon and ran to her, catching her before she collapsed. "You're alive." She looked up at him, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Barely," she said, her voice hoarse. "But I told you, I wouldn't let them harm you." Ethan helped her to a chair, his mind racing as he searched the shelves for a medkit. "What happened? How did you get away?" Catherine winced as she leaned back, her breathing labored. "I didn't. I killed them. All of them." Ethan froze, staring at her in disbelief. "All of them? How?" She chuckled weakly. "Zal warriors are strong, but they underestimate those who fight for something other than pride. I fought for survival. For us." Ethan's throat tightened, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He found the medkit and began treating her wounds, his hands shaking. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. "You could have left me." Catherine's silver eyes locked onto his, their intensity cutting through his guilt. "I chose to stay, just like you chose to fight beside me. Out here, choices are all we have." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He nodded, focusing on cleaning a deep gash on her arm. "Well, I sent a distress signal. Hopefully, someone friendly will pick it up." Catherine snorted. "Friendly Zale. That's a rare breed." Ethan managed a weak smile. "Then we'll make our own friends. We survived this far. We can survive anything." Catherine's smirk softened into something resembling a smile. "You're learning, human." As he finished tending to her wounds, the outpost's console beeped again, a response to the distress signal. Ethan rushed to the screen, his heart pounding. The message was brief but clear. A ship was en route. "They're coming," Ethan said, glancing back at Catherine. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Then we'll see what kind of allies we summoned." The storm outside had faded, but Ethan knew their journey was far from over. Together, they had faced the wilds, the wolves, and the hunters. Now, they stood at the edge of something new, a fragile alliance forged in the frozen wasteland. As the faint sound of engines approached in the distance, Ethan couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together.